have returned from the mists to tell you about speech bubbles. If you're watching this, you probably know what a speech bubble is. You're probably just curious about how to use them better, how to make them look nicer, and hopefully this will help. So first off, there are many kinds of speech bubbles. Again, you probably know this, but how do you make them good? So regardless of the shape of the speech bubble, regardless of the type that you want to use, because there are various types, if you're looking at like more Western comics, you're probably used to seeing ovals that are horizontally wider than they are vertically tall, because that fits usually English writing or, romantic writing, I guess. Whereas if you have read manga, which is originally written in Japanese, which can be read top to bottom, as well as right to left instead of left to right, you may be used to seeing speech bubbles that are taller than they are wide. And of course, there are tons of other different kinds of speech bubbles. They can be square. This can be used as like a caption. Often people will use it for like a robot speaking or a voice from a telephone or a voice off of like a TV or a radio. But speech bubbles can be any shape, really, so long as the text can fit inside it. There's also captions, or I've seen it used as like thought bubbles as well, where there won't even be like a container for the speech. The text will just be like on the panel, maybe with like an outline on it. There are thought bubbles, which can be in starbursts. They can be, the stereotypical thought bubble where they look like a cloud with some little trails coming off them. Like, there's so many different kinds of speech bubbles. You can make them your own. If you have, say, like a monster that has like a really different way of speaking, you can style your speech bubbles to like look like anything. They're very, very versatile. But the important thing, no matter kind of what style you choose, whether, no matter which one you want to use, the best thing to do is to make sure that it is legible, very easy to read, and you want to make sure that it fits in with your composition. That's the biggest mistake I see with newcomers putting speech bubbles on their comics, like first-time comic creators, people who are new to it. Speech bubbles tend to be forgotten until kind of the last stage of making their comic page, and then the speech bubbles just kind of get crammed off into the corner. Text doesn't really fit inside them. There wasn't forethought into where to put it, and so it just kind of gets jammed and put off to the side and makes it difficult to read. It can make the page difficult to follow. Here's what I advise. Let's start with making it legible. So again, your speech bubble can really be anything. There's so many different types. It really just depends on the story you want to tell, but the best rule of thumb for your speech bubbles is to put your text down, choose a font that is easy to read. There are typical comic fonts. Traditionally they were like handwritten. They have a very like pen and ink look to them. They're usually in all caps. They might kind of look like Comic Sans if you're very new to them, but they are very different from Comic Sans if you're a typography nerd. But yeah, there are stereotypical comic fonts you can use. If you're looking for a resource where you can find them for free or for good prices, you can go to Blambot. I'll leave a link in the description. They have a bunch of really great fonts, and a lot of them are free to use. So I would start with those. I would start with some nice comic fonts. You don't have to use like a comic font. It is also okay to use other fonts. You may want to use like a sans serif, like something like, maybe not Helvetica, but something that looks like Helvetica for various reasons. It could be for a special speech bubble, like a special way of someone speaking. They have a different font that is very unique to them. Again, you could use it for like a robot. You could give them a very like futuristic looking font that makes them stand out as like having a different voice. You could also just prefer to use something else stylistically. For example, you maybe want to use like a serif font, think like Georgia Times New Roman, just because stylistically maybe it works. I've seen it used in stories where they're more historical setting, maybe, where it just fits the vibe of the comic. For our comic, The Books of Avo, which is a comic adaptation of a novel that Bones wrote, for our captions, so like non-speech, we use like a typewriter font. Just stylistically, that's what we wanted to use, because we wanted to say like, this is I guess it's a nod to like, it was originally a novel. This was description that was in the novel. And we use typewriter because it is set in like a 20s inspired thing. We just thought it was cute. So there are places where you can use different fonts to different effects. I would just, no matter what you choose, think about why you're choosing it. And honestly, sometimes it can just be like, I like it, I think it looks good. That is an okay reason to choose a font. I guess if you're looking for things to avoid, I would avoid Comic Sans. A lot of people will grab it as like a comic font, just because like it does look kind of like a comic font, but I guess snobby people might look down on it and not read it. So you run the risk of like alienating some readers. They might not like it. They might stick their nose up at it. And I would also say that if you choose a serif font, so again, think like Times New Roman, that kind of style of font, that font is designed to work really well in large pieces of text. It's meant to be like legible in a paragraph on a page. And so it's, I don't know, you might not be getting its full usage if you're using it within speech bubbles or words on its own. But again, it's your stylistic choice. You can do whatever you want. Don't let me yuck your yum. And yeah, and I think just if you're looking to like look like a comic, I would recommend using comic style fonts that people have created. Now, thirdly, you can hand letter. I would recommend against this unless you have really nice handwriting. That is very legible. The important part is that it's easy to read for your readers. So if you're not sure that you can make really legible, easy to read handwriting, I would recommend against it. I would also recommend against it because it takes a lot of time to hand letter everything yourself. Now again, if that's something you really want to do, you're like, this works for the style of my comic, I love hand lettering, go for it. That is awesome. I love a good hand lettered comic. In fact, one of my favorites, Cucumber Quest, is all hand lettered. It can be really, really awesome and beautiful, but again, it can be really difficult. And I know some people will say like, oh, I'll make a font out of my handwriting. You totally can do that. Again, just make sure it's legible, make sure it's easy to read, it can make nice lines, but you can totally make a font out of your own handwriting and save yourself time. When it comes to like all the nitty gritty around your font, no matter what you choose, if you're looking into typography, what you're going to hear is kerning and leading. So leading is the space between lines of text. So think line height when you think leading. You want, when you're spacing between your lines of text in your speech bubbles, you don't want it so wide that each line feels separate from each other. You want them grouped together pretty nicely so that they feel like they're part of a little paragraph, I guess. But you don't want them so tight that it's hard to discern between the lines of text. If it's too tight, it can be hard for anyone to read, but it can be especially hard for people with, say, dyslexia or other disabilities around reading. You want something nicely spaced. There's kind of like a science to like leading and kerning, and you can totally deep dive into that. I'm not going to go into that here. For one, I'm not great at it. I kind of girl math it, but I would say stick to kind of like a 1.2. 1.5 would be like the largest. So if you're looking at like a word processor, you know how like you can pick like line spacing or line height and it'll be like 1.0, 1.1, 1.2. If you're using that, stick between like 1.1 to 1.3, I think. It depends on the font. Some fonts have very tight line spacing, some have very wide, so it really depends on what font you have. I guess a general rule of thumb is probably 1.2, 1.3, I would say is pretty good line spacing. 1.5 would be the largest, because then, the lines can feel a little too separate, and 0.0, they can feel too tight. But choose one that you like, and then stick to it for every speech bubble or every piece of text to keep it consistent. Then with kerning, that is the space between letters. So think horizontal space between letters. I wouldn't really touch that unless you have a font where the letters are really tightly spaced. The only time I, as a graphic designer or doing lettering for comics, the only time I've really played around with that is if I was doing, say, a really standout piece of text, like a sound effect, or I've used it as like part of logos kind of thing, where I've spaced out things or made lettering more tight to make things fit. So I wouldn't really mess with your kerning or your spacing between letters unless you have a really good effect in mind. And if you're using a font where like the kerning is really tight, I might choose a different font. It would just make your life easier. But again, up to you. There's lots of ways to deep dive into kerning as well, but personally I wouldn't really touch it. Most fonts are created with some nice kerning already. Now the last bit of making your fonts legible within your speech bubbles has to do with the container of your bubble. So one, your text should fit within the shape of its container. Your text is kind of like, think of it as water, or a liquid. A liquid will fill the shape of its container. You're not working with a solid here, you're working with a liquid. So you want it to fit within the shape that you've designated for your speech bubble. However, we're going to pretend in this metaphor that the liquid has like a little magnetic field that is opposing to the magnetic field of your speech bubble, so it's pulled away from the sides of its container. This is a bad metaphor, but hear me out. And this is called padding. So if you're ever hearing me on stream talking about padding, this is what I mean. Padding I get from when I've done like little software development stuff. It's essentially like negative space inside a container. So again, it's that magnetic field that is pushing against our text. It's allowing breathing room around the text so that the outline of our speech bubble isn't touching the text, making it hard to read. It's giving negative space so we can see the text clearly. Padding is very important. Make sure you have a good amount of padding around your text. Now, again, how much padding do you use? It can be a stylistic thing. Some people really like having a lot of negative space around their text. Some people like having kind of more tight bubbles. It can depend on your preference. It can depend on how much kind of real estate you have within a panel. Sometimes panels like are designed where the speech bubble's a little bit smaller. Sometimes you can see this in, say, like a translated comic, say like a manga, again, from Japanese to English. Sometimes the phrase in Japanese is a lot smaller, whereas it's a lot longer in English. So sometimes when you're reading a manga, you might see the text kind of crammed into this tiny little speech bubble, and you don't get as much padding. But if you are making your comic, you have a lot more control over how much padding there is. So again, it's up to preference. I personally like a good amount of padding. I would say, rule of thumb, probably make it like, take like the height of one line of text and double it. And that is like the amount of padding you want leading off your text. But again, it's totally up to preference. Just make sure that padding is there. You want breathing room around your text. It makes it easier to read. And I think the last thing to consider for legibility is contrast. So when you're designing your text and your speech bubble, typically it'll be like a white speech bubble with black text on top. That is great contrast. The black text stands out really well against the white background. You may switch it for stylistic reasons. It could be like a thought bubble. It could be a remembered like flashback piece of speech. It could be like an evil creature speaking, so they have like a black speech bubble with white text on it. Again, this is good contrast regardless of why you're using this style of speech bubble, but this is good contrast because it's white on black. Now if you're using colors, whether you want just like colored text or speech bubbles for everything, whether it's like a special speech bubble, again, just make sure you have good contrast. You want it as close to black and white as possible without it being that, I guess. You don't want it like a mid-tone gray on a mid-tone gray kind of thing. And if you're not sure, because it can be hard to tell the contrast when you're working in color can be kind of tricky with our eyes, I would recommend turning your page to black and white momentarily to just check the contrast, make sure that the text is easy to read, it does not blend in with the background. And again, you can use light on dark or dark on light. That is good contrast. And again, this is up to preference, but make it contrasty, make it legible. And I guess the final element of a single speech bubble would probably be the tail. So considerations for the tail. With a speech bubble, it's typically like a little point that comes off of your speech bubble. They can be curved, they can be straight. The end doesn't have to be pointy, but they usually taper off. For thought bubbles, not all of them, you'll see like little cloud circles coming off it that taper down to smaller ones as they near the character. Again, stylistically, it's just whatever you like. The only thing I would say is make it clear who is speaking by using your tail. So the tail of your speech bubble, when I started, for a really long time, kind of an embarrassingly long time, I just assumed that the tail had to point at the character. It didn't matter kind of like where it pointed to them. I had someone point out, just a matter of years ago, that bubble tails are supposed to point towards the face of a character. And I think that's a good rule of thumb. You don't need the tail, like, touching their mouth. That was also something I saw from a lot of like people who are starting out, but that's usually like really, really young people, like kids who are making their first comic. They'll have the speech bubble tail like in the mouth of the character, which you don't need. You can just have it pointing at their mouth. It can be a little farther away, it can be closer, just depending on what you need for your composition. But generally pointing at the mouth or face of your character is a way to make it very clear who is speaking or thinking this. But I will say, if your composition makes that impossible, I think just having the tail pointing at the character is still usable. As long as people know who's speaking, I think that's the important part. Now, there are cases where you may have no tail on your speech bubble. This can be when someone is not in the panel who is speaking. This can be like a remembered piece of text, like a kind of a piece of speech from a flashback that someone's remembering. It can be used when someone is like a continued piece of speech where we know who's speaking, so we don't need to see the tail over and over again. There's lots of ways to use it. I would test it when you're using it. Have someone quickly read through it and tell you who they think is speaking. Sometimes it can be confusing, and that's usually down to like they might need more context clues as to who's speaking. Sometimes it's very intuitive. If you have someone speaking and then we jump to the next panel and they're not in that panel, but we see no tail on the bubble, it is typically kind of known by people familiar with comics that this person is speaking. It can also be read from the context clues of like, this is their continued monologue. People are pretty intuitive of picking that up. I've seen some people where they'll label speech bubbles, like they'll put the little initial or a little character face. I would avoid this unless you make it like a very determined stylistic choice. Like it when I see it, I usually think like they weren't confident that I would know who is speaking. Like with some exceptions, there's sometimes I've seen it where it feels very deliberate. Like I've seen it used in comedic ways where we'll see like cute little faces of characters speaking. Like we don't see them, they're very far away, say. And it's basically used as like character art. It's very deliberate, it's very fun and cute. But I wouldn't lean on it. I would design your pages so that you can easily tell who is speaking without marking who is speaking with like initials or character faces or whatever. Have someone read it, see what they think, go from there kind of thing. There's other ways I've seen people use tails. I've seen people use like kind of a cutout tail, like it, instead of pointing out from the bubble, it like cuts into the bubble. I've seen this used to show that someone is speaking off panel. Again, this is a stylistic choice. I don't see it everywhere, so it doesn't seem to be like a common thing people use, but it is usable. I would say whatever you choose to do, whether it's with your text, with your speech bubble tails, with your speech bubble shapes, colors, whatever you use, just try to be consistent within it. For example, if every time that the villain speaks, they have like a colored speech bubble, always use that for their speech. If every time characters are in a flashback, they have, italicized text or like wiggly text or something. I don't know what you're going to use, but just stick to it so that when the reader sees this, they're like, oh, we're in a flashback. As long as you're consistent with whatever styles you choose, you're good. So that's legibility and kind of like the elements of your speech bubble. Hopefully that is a good start for kind of what to do for your speech bubbles. Now, I think one of the biggest considerations that you need to look at next is your composition of your page and when to include speech bubbles. And by that, I mean you should be planning your speech bubbles into your pages as early as possible. Don't leave it to the last minute. Like I said, it leads to really weird looking pages. It leads to having trouble with like fitting your text into your speech bubble. Make sure as early as possible, even in the thumbnailing stage, you are planning where you put your speech bubbles. They are part of your composition as much as your beautiful, beautiful character art is, your beautiful background art. Your speech bubble is also part of this page. And it's a really important part of your comic flow. Comic flow being how you use visual elements to lead the reader's eye around the page. You want them to start, if they're reading say an English Western style comic, you want them to start at the top left with your first panel, go to the next panel, then down to the next line, to the next panel, etc. until they go off the page on the bottom right. And speech bubbles are a really great tool in this. Often when someone looks at a comic page, they will first look at the speech bubble. So you can really use your speech bubbles to direct your reader around the page. I can do another video about comic flow if people would like, where I can go into more kind of tips to help you lead your reader's eye around, but your speech bubbles are so important. They will follow text. They will follow text before they look at the art. You can use the tails of your speech bubbles to lead people around. They will follow them like lines. You can use where you place the speech bubble, the shape of the speech bubble to lead people around. They're so important. And ways to make this easy, I would say in the penciling phase, when you're sketching things out to be a bit more clear before you say ink or color or finish it up, I would put in your text as it will appear on the final page. So put it in the font you want to use so that you know how much room your speech bubble is going to take up in a panel. And you don't have to draw things behind your speech bubbles that way. If you've placed them in that early stage, the rest of your art can fit around them and makes less drawing for you. And then you can showcase your beautiful art around your speech bubbles. And I think that is the most important part when you're planning out your speech bubbles. First is the stylistic stuff that you kind of figure out when you're planning your comic in the visual development stage. And then this is your day-to-day. As you work on your comic, you are planning where to put your speech bubbles or your captions, thought bubbles, etc. And you're planning them into your composition. They are so important. Do not neglect them. And that's it. Hopefully this was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. If there's anything I didn't cover or anything that was confusing, I would love to know. Yeah, I hope this helped. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing because we put out lots of comic related tips. You can become a Patreon supporter or a YouTube channel member if you would like to get critiques of your artwork or writing from me and Bones, the other fella on this channel, and join us for weekly live streams where we make art and sometimes we play games. I don't know how to end this. It's been a while. I've been lost in the mists. Goodbye. I love you all. I will return to the void from whence I came. Goodbye.